English translation, 704th Contact Part 3, Thursday the 1st of March 2018, 21:54 hours.
As you wish. But on the other hand, the whole thing is not of importance for mission work and mission learning, which is why you should not go further into such questions, which also keep you from your actual important work, whereby it is also to be said that there can be no question of importance regarding such questions.
You have already said that, and so shall it be in future.
Then I want to say about your article from the 14th of January, which Njana photographed and gave to me to read, that I have read it and found it to be correct, elaborative, and good, and also presents the facts correctly.
Thanks. I will add it to our conversation right here then, which I do not think needs any further explanation.
Threat of war escalation by the USA and EU dictatorship.
The war-threatening situation on Earth is escalating ever more, for it becomes quite evident that Western hatred, especially that of the USA and the EU dictatorship of Russia, is intensifying, which may indicate that a war or something destructive is being prepared against Russia. This is also demonstrated by the encirclement of Russia with Western military bases, with NATO also getting involved, which is increasingly penetrating into the East and thus into Russia. And the fact that this is the case is clearly demonstrated by the USA with its missile defense shield against Russia, as has also been and is proven by Western operations in Ukraine. And if this is carried on in this way, it can lead to a new, serious, and fourth World War, which will then be total. And this danger already exists through the warmongering machinations of the USA and the EU dictatorship. Although China would then also be included in such a fourth World War, because the USA also flirts with it in relation to world domination. However, if this madness becomes a reality, that the USA, in its megalomania, reaches for Russia and possibly also China, then Russia and China, like the USA, will defend themselves with nuclear weapons. And if the megalomania and world domination of the USA forces Russia and China into such a war, then it will be so violent that there are no more winners and nothing will remain. For this reason, there can only be one slogan for all forces for peace. It means that the folk of the United States of America and the EU dictatorship must say no to their power-obsessed and warmongering rulers and remove them from office. The USA and the EU dictatorship must abandon their insanity to bring other states under their control and into bondage, strife, and lack of justice. The USA in particular is effectively running in world imperial structures of war and destruction, whereby the EU dictatorship also shows similar airs and graces, as well as NATO, which is constantly striving to expand its power, but in this respect, the state powers of Germany are not lagging behind and show similar ambitions. Now, it is imperative that a worldwide appeal be initiated and addressed to the humanity on Earth, whether it wants peace or war, as well as justice, freedom or injustice and lack of freedom. First and foremost, however, it must be borne in mind that, if peace, freedom and justice are really to be achieved, all warmongers in the states concerned must first and foremost be removed from their government, military and secret service offices, and so on. In this regard, there is an urgent need for the populations of all countries that fall under the category of countries of warmongering and world domination to do everything required and necessary in order to appoint the right, good and capable people, who are oriented towards the well-being of the peoples and of all mankind on Earth, as ruling state authorities. The peoples of such states themselves decide in full conscious certainty for peace, freedom and justice, without any form of conviction, but in certainty of reality and its truth, because a conviction corresponds in every case to a suggestive persuasion or influence, manipulation and seduction. Consequently, the folk alone must bear responsibility for ensuring that all government leaders who are warmongering, selfish, desperate for power and addicted to power are no longer allowed to have power, but only the majority of the entire folk, and in any case only in accordance with the will of the folk. Only in this way can an effective and true democracy be and prevail, in which not the rulers, but the majority of the folk decide for peace, freedom and justice and determine everything. Although it must also be clear that religion and sectarianism have nothing to do with this, and that in this respect no state-induced demands and connections must neither be nor exist. And since a people is made up of a large number of people who, of course, are not all of the same views and interests, there must be, on the one hand, a fair electoral system through which a majority of voters can support or reject an electoral objective. On the other hand, there is an inevitable need for an absolutely detailed, correct and clear statement to the electorate on the positive and negative effects of the electoral objectives, so that the electorate can understand the situation and weigh the pros and cons against each other. Only in this way can and must a true democracy be understood, because only in this way does it mean a real rule of the common people. There must be no unlimited power, and no abuse of power to the detriment of the people to rulers, the military, secret services, and organizations linked to or aligned with these. But the people or peoples themselves must be given power for security, peace, freedom, justice, and democracy in the form of majority decisions. Only in this way can everything in a state function properly, peacefully, liberally and justly, and in fact also outwardly, to all other countries peace, freedom and justice be preserved and maintained and reign permanently. This also includes the separation of powers, fundamental rights, human rights and freedom of expression, as well as freedom, equality and fraternity, whereby fraternity must in principle mean both sexes, that is to say woman and man. However, some of the terms mentioned require some explanation, so some of these values need to be explained. Safe, freedom of faith, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of philosophy and freedom of belief, as well as freedom of politics, etc. are also included, but this does not require any special explanations. 1. Separation of powers is an alternative or technical term in relation to the actual government, which acts as head of state, president, minister, secretary of state, etc., which also includes the administration, that is to say all the authorities and offices, etc., which have to implement all decisions taken. Together, the gubernative and the administrative form the executive branch. The separation of powers ensures that the power of the state is distributed among several state bodies, for the purpose of limiting the power of one state body, that such a power cannot possess and apply unrestricted power, but also that freedom, equality, and fraternity are guaranteed. In Switzerland, power is in the hands of 3 different authorities or state bodies with regard to the separation of powers. One is the legislature or legislative power, then the executive branch has executive power, and the judiciary has jurisdiction. On the one hand, the legislature and thus legislative and thus legal and respectively legislation and respectively law exerts its power. On the other hand, the executive and executing, respectively, executive and public security and order exercising power, and the third is the judicial and judicially exercising power. However, it must be understood that the term Gewalt does not mean any criminal acts, but the application of the laws and rights of a state and the righteous means determined by the people to enforce these laws and rights. State authority refers to the exercise of sovereign power within a country's territory by its bodies elected by the people. Corresponding institutions, such as the head of state, government and administration, as well as the army and police, parliament and courts. In a separate and regulatory form, the executive is the power to govern, with the legislature being the legislative power controlled by the government, while the judiciary controls the government and the legislature. The executive, legislative and judicial branches are strictly separated. That is the real principle of the separation of powers, which corresponds to a fundamental principle of democracy, but which is not fully present in any state throughout the world. A semi-democracy prevails only in Switzerland, while all other earthly states have no real democracy, but only claim, contrary to all truth, that they are democratic, with the republics in particular on the front line with such false claims in this respect. In fact, in the case of the republics, the peoples have practically only a right to determine the election of their state leaders, but not their actions and the actual state leadership and state actions, which means that the state leaders arbitrarily determine and act above the heads of the population. In Switzerland, a separation of powers was introduced in the Federal Constitution of 1848, whereby this separation of powers prevented the concentration of power of individual persons or institutions and put a stop to the abuse of power, which is further guaranteed by the fact that a person belonging to a state authority may only belong to one of the three state authorities at a time. 2. Freedom and fraternity. These terms are actually borrowed from a motto and correspond to a French slogan of the French Republic and the Republic of Haiti, but the whole thing is known as a libet, égalité, fraternité, and is based on the slogans of the French Revolution of 1789, which, however, can be bound in an expanded and somewhat altered Swiss sense to the Rutlischwur of the first three Swiss citizens Werner Stauffacher von Schwyz, Walter Fürst von Uy, and Arnold von Melchthal unter Walden. In this respect, the words of Friedrich Schiller, which he wrote for the drama The Wilhelm Tell, come into their own. Schiller, whose full first name was Johann Christoph Friedrich, was born on the 10th of November, 1759 in Marbach am Neckar, Germany, and died in Weimar on the 9th of May, 1805. In 1802 he was ennobled, and in addition, he was a doctor, poet and philosopher, but also a historian and is regarded as one of the most important German playwrights, lyricists and essayists. The dazzling drama William Tell refers to August 1291 as Switzerland's national holiday, and thus to the legend of the Rutlischwurs of the Old Swiss against Habsburg. At that time, three brave men from Uy, Schwyz, and Unterwalden were said to have been the first Swiss to gather on the Rutli and conspire for freedom and independence. 3. The idea of establishing 1291 as the year in which the Swiss Confederation was founded and the 1st of August as the Swiss federal holiday dates back to the initiative of the people of Bern. According to legend, the Swiss Federal Charter was concluded at the beginning of August 1291, for which Schiller coined the following words for the Rutlish Oath: "We want to be a single folk of brethren, never to part in danger nor distress. We want to be free, as our fathers were, and rather die than live in slavery. We want to trust in the one highest God, and never be afraid of human power." 4. Equality must be interpreted somewhat above all in a political and philosophical context, so that a correspondence of a number of things, persons, facts in a particular characteristic in the case of differences, exists in other characteristics, including in relation to human rights and peoples before the laws, etc. In this sense, it is also to be understood that an equality between two or more objects and one or more properties, also with regard to the laws, the state, and each individual citizen. Equality also refers to the relationship between objects or persons to be compared, such as equality with regard to quality, quantity, or of the relation, which is determined by the method of comparison. If equality is related to man, then it embodies a general ideal of justice, which in the earthly history of mankind and its development already effectively goes back over 2,000 years. Besides freedom and fraternity, equality must be a fundamental democratic principle that all men must be equal before the law. 5. Fundamental rights. Human rights and freedom of expression allow everyone to freely exercise their individual religious convictions in the form of religion, politics or ideology, which, in addition to belonging to a religious or ideological community, also includes cultic activity. 6. Democracy. It can actually still be explained that the ancient democracies in Greece and the Roman Empire, which emanated from Athens and Rome, were the real forerunners of today's so-called democracies and were orientated toward reaction to the too greater might of the rulers. But it was only after the Enlightenment, in the 17th and 18th centuries, that philosophers formulated essential elements of the modern democracy, after which the values and forms that promote peace, freedom, justice, and popular participation were gradually included as important components in this concept of a democracy. 7. Faith. Freedom of faith, freedom of religion, and freedom of philosophy correspond to a naturally predetermined right of man and guarantee him, in relation to a religion, sect as well as philosophy, etc., to freely exercise and represent a faith of any kind, insofar as the whole of the right is and does not in any way conflict with human moral, human and physical health, generally life and state security conditioned as well as state-prescribed right and law, but is legally just, juristically legal or legitimate, regular, permissible, and thus constitutionally unobjectionable, allowed and acceptable in any form of what is permitted. This must be so according to man's freedom of his own will and the resulting self-decision, whereby he can believe something unprovable or reject it according to intellect and rationality or fathom the effective truth. Effectively, however, a religious sectarian faith can never be proven to be correct, because it is based on a fixed and imaginative idea that usually arises from a conviction. 8. Religion, sectarianism, beliefs, philosophy, ideology, and state. Nothing can be objected to faith, freedom of religion, freedom of philosophy, and any ideology, for all this corresponds to the right of every individual. But the whole in relation to faith, freedom of philosophy, and any ideology may not be determined, directed, exploited financially or otherwise, and taxed by the state. This means that every religion, sect, every faith, every philosophy and ideology in absolutely every respect must exist and must exist independently of the state, so consequently, a separation of religion, faith, philosophy, and ideology must be given. If the Christian religion is taken as a starting point in this respect, then this means that there must be a separation of church and state, which also applies to all other religions and their soul launching pads. The state must therefore have no right for the Christian churches, from their believers and from legal persons, and so on, to raise taxes in order to finance the churches, their operation and maintenance, and to remunerate the priests. It must be right that the state keeps itself free in this respect as well as from the remuneration of preachers, priests, cardinals, bishops, pope, and clergymen. With regard to state and religion, etc., the false state religion constitutional law existing in various states, in Christianity state church law, machinations and models with regard to tax claims by the state, are a farce. To pay taxes for a cause of deceit and deception, for a religion, sects, a confused faith, a philosophy and ideology, that is probably more than just criminal. So man, his religious, sectarian, philosophical belief or other confused ideology is considered important and a guideline for his life and behavior, even if hardly any believer sees this as such and lives by it, but tangled himself in his own deceit and in his self-deception, because in his faith he leads far away from all reality and its effective truth as well as his life. This makes the whole outlook and faith behavior of man in relation to reality and its irrefutable truth roaringly ridiculous. And for this ridiculousness, the followers of faith, sects, religion, philosophy and ideology pay state taxes if everything is legitimate under state constitutional law with regard to institutions, religious communities, sectarianism, philosophies, and ideologies under state tax law. But the opposite must be the case, because it is only in this way correct and right, that only the faithful or members of an institution, such as religion, sect, philosophy, or ideology of any kind, have to pay their mite to their institution or organization, etc., which must never be done by the participation of the state. Dasun. A religion, sect, philosophy, or ideology must never be of a state nature, according to which a state must also have no right to levy taxes on such institutions from the faithful or legal persons. Every religion, sect, philosophy, ideology, and thus also every religious community, as well as every legal person and every knowledge community of any kind, must be organizationally separated from the state by state laws. Just as everything that is mentally cultivated and represented by people must be free of state taxes. 9. Belief is based on a factor of self-suggestion or self-created self-suggestive imagination and thus on a resulting delusion. A belief is in any case a factor of a suggestive faith which comes about through fear, false gratitude, or confused hope, etc. Belief always takes place in such a way that someone influences another person, or he influences himself for some unrealistic reason, religiously, sectarian, or in some form of another opinion, assertion, or thing, etc. suggestively. This creates a firm and unshakable faith in a suggestive object that mocks every real experience. Every belief is based on a foreign or one's own suggestively generated opinion, imagination, and thus on a delusion, which is as foreign to every reality and its truth as every conscious malicious lie is to the effective, experienceable, and tangible reality. This is because a belief corresponds in every case to a suggestive persuasion or influencing, manipulation, and seduction. A belief creates in humans, through suggestive acting, fellow human beings, speeches, events, situations, religions or sectarianism, and all kinds of occurrences, etc., or through confused self-suggestion, a new opinion, and thus an imagination, a delusion, and a faith. And this is fixed in his consciousness, in his thoughts, and in the feelings arising from them. In this way, the whole is conceived as a faith beyond the intellect and reason of man, following which a suggestively conditioned belief is evoked in him that is far removed from all reality and truth. This also happens through an appropriate self-suggestive way, when man convinces himself or suggestively creates a faith for himself and thus falls into imagination and a delusion that is unrealistic and untruthful, and in this way ignores his intellect and his reason as well as the certainty of truth. 10. Certainty and uncertainty. Certainty corresponds to the effective form of reality, that is to say, reality and its truth, whereby any conceivable form of belief is nothing other than an uncertainty that completely contradicts reality, that is to say, reality and its truth. Certainty is a firm, unshakable knowledge, statement, and opinion gained by consciously examining a fact and by experiencing and being experienced. Thus only the clear and real certainty proves to be correct in every respect, because it is not the uncertainty and belief, but exclusively the certainty results in the effective, recognizable and comprehensible real proofs and facts in relation to the factuality of reality, that is to say, reality and its irrefutable truth, which is absolutely unshakable until the distant future. So that is what had to be explained in this respect, but all this led away from all that I want to say about the agitated warmongering, criminal intrigues, and criminal machinations of US-American political and military machinations that have been stirring up the whole world since time immemorial. Indeed, the fact that since the US-America has existed, the United States of America has always and almost exclusively been at the forefront, and can be mentioned in this regard, in terms of warmongering and world domination, as well as malicious Secret Service actions and warfare with inhuman war crimes all over the world. Already in the early days of the USA, many of the immigrated new population and their descendants, mainly from all over Europe and Asia, including many sectarians, criminals, and outlaws, many of whom were expelled or fled from their home countries, harassed, murdered, and robbed the natives of their land. And this happened not only by the farmers, ranchers, cattle barons, criminals and outlaws, and other land thieves, but especially under the leadership of the power-addicted, belligerent elites of the former government and the military and secret services, who were eager to rob the natives and the Indians of their traditional territories and homeland through bloody wars and tens of thousands of murder massacres. Yes, the natives of America were removed, murdered and slaughtered by war massacres by immigrants from all over Europe, mainly from all over Europe, from their homelands, taking away not only their homeland but also all their strength and power to continue to exist independently. Well, it has also been a fact since time immemorial, and this has remained unbroken to this day, that the boundless obsession with power, the falseness, underhandedness and the greed for world food in the USA continue to scare and frighten the populations of many countries around the world from underhand US Secret Service or US warlike machinations. And all these people will continue to live into the future with the uncertainty of a possible further and globally destructive world war with nuclear weapons brought about by the USA. All these folk, who live worldwide in fear of the greed for world domination, want to live in peace, freedom and justice and hope that a fair and good power will finally emerge, such as a worldwide peace-fighting force, that will be able to push all the domination-addicted and power-hungry powers of the government, military and secret service elites of the United States of America off the pedestal of their greed for world domination. And if the earth is to become peaceful, then the people of every country must inevitably become active together with all other populations of the earth and form a peace movement in the form of a worldwide peace-fighting force through which on the one hand real peace and freedom and justice is created among all peoples and people, just as on the other hand also in every state a state leadership may only be determined by the peoples themselves and which may only act and work according to the decisions given by the peoples. For this, it is also necessary that all peoples agree to the following important prerequisites. There must be a willingness, the will and the assertiveness to maintain a lasting peace, freedom and justice in every respect. All hostilities and warlike airs and graces, ambitions, agitations, actions and deeds, etc. must be ended immediately and without ifs and buts. Every person, folk and government must immediately be concerned with lifting and ending sanctions against other persons, folks or states without delay and with working towards lasting relations in the spirit of peaceful, liberal and equitable cooperation and partnership. Any person of understanding, reason and responsibility in any state must immediately say no without any ifs and buts and refuse to act against the body, life and safety of the people, just as he must also outlaw all aggressions directed and demanded by governments, state powers, secret services and the military, etc. in hostile, unpeaceful, unfree, and unjust form against another country, its population, a group of people or against an individual person. Today, as it has been since ancient times, when people were still beating their skulls with clubs, there are still the same dangers in terms of strife, lack of freedom, injustice, war, murder, and manslaughter. So nothing has changed for the better with regard to the hostilities of men since time immemorial. On the contrary, everything has become worse and worse. 3 world wars from 1756 to 1763, 1914 to 1918, and 1939 to 1945, along with countless other weapons, wars and other murderous and massacring events and actions, have claimed hundreds of millions of lives in virtually every country on Earth over the last 13 millennia. And even today there is still no end to this madness, or even an estimate of its effects, for there is always a new danger looming of world war. Again, in all countries of the world. Insane thinking and behavior are being used to upgrade weapons of war, and madness has never been so degenerate as it is today, with threats regarding the use of nuclear weapons and even worse. Especially, as has been the case since time immemorial, the US is in first place with such threats, but so is North Korea. Where both states are ruled by apparent lunatics, the US by a stupid trample trumpeter named Trump, and North Korea by a lunatic, stupid, brainless, fratricidal and kinship murderer named Kim Jong-un. But that's not all, because all of the world's state-governing madmen who are building their countries into weapons-bursting destruction depots live in the madness of the idea that they would have to create a weapons balance against the other and hostile countries with a tremendously deadly and all-destroying weapons collection hodgepodge. And so, they believe in their delusion they could instill fear and terror into the enemy and prevent an attack on their country and a war from breaking out. In this way, a completely erroneous and insane arsenal balance of weapons is completely stupidly assumed to prevent an attack by the enemy and a war. But today's war-threatening situation continues to escalate, with the great threat and warmongering emanating, as ever, from the United States of America, and how could it be otherwise, directed against Russia, which the world domination-addicted USA would love so much to incorporate as a defeated vassal state. So, after wars of aggression against Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, a war against Russia is being prepared, although the USA is also considering China, somehow secretly at the moment. The fact is that, on the one hand, the United States and, on the other hand, NATO, to which the EU dictatorship also extends its hand if possible, have the audacity to move ever more eastwards from the West in order to encircle Russia with military bases. So the construction of a US missile defense shield is being pushed ahead, just as Western operations in Ukraine are part of this increasingly precarious confrontation. Also, Hollande, the snobbish French president from 2012 to 2017, declared in February 2015 megalomaniacally, "We are at war, and this war can become total." And indeed, today there is a danger of another and fourth world war. But if the megalomaniac USA and those who attack Russia with these megalomaniacs of NATO and the EU dictatorship attack, then Russia will defend itself and let a nuclear monster break loose, which at least destroys, if not more, not only the majority of the Western Hemisphere. And if this impending disaster, which has already been conjured up and is floating like a sword of Damocles over the world, actually breaks out through the USA, NATO and EU dictatorship, through the insane madness of the Western powers, above all the USA, NATO and EU dictatorship, then what former Secretary of State Willie Wimmer said in November 2014 will happen, then it will be the case that nothing will remain of us. If all these things, factors and facts are now considered, then there is only the solution for the peoples of the USA and the EU dictatorship, as well as for NATO, to exhort themselves and finally put an end to their agitation and enmity against Russia. And for all people on Earth who want peace, freedom and justice, it should be said that there is only one solution, namely to stand up to their warmongering and belligerent governments, military and secret services, etc., and refuse to take up arms for these stupid and erroneous and power-obsessed and lame, unprincipled, non-understanding, irrational and irresponsible morons. So the only solution for the survival of mankind on Earth is that the people strictly refuse to risk their lives for their mad, power-addicted, weak and insane, warmongering state powers, military and secret services, etc., not to throw their lives away and not to go to war, in which there will be no winner, but only losers and a completely destroyed Earth. So for this reason there is only one thing for all forces of peace: freedom and justice, to say no and refuse to bow down after the will of the state powers possessed by hatred against other countries and to do their will by going to war for them. All people of all peoples of the world must step out of the control of their warmongering state powers and say goodbye to the imperial structures of war. Understanding and reason demand that the entire West, above all, the war and world domination-loving USA, but also NATO and the EU dictatorship, finally put aside their traditional cowardly fear and terror of Russia as well as their hatred of Russia. And with regard to the USA, they must finally give up their erroneous ambitions regarding the annexation of Russia or their violent attempt to take possession of Russia and, on the contrary, cooperate with Russia in a peaceful, liberal and just manner. According to statements and explanations of the Ptaah, the USA has been striving for well over 100 years to annex Russia by war and coercion and to make it a US vassal state, during which time the USA has also done and continues to do everything in its power to prevent Europe and the European states from being able to ally themselves with Russia or from being able to do so now or in the future through an alliance. However, this measure of prevention should not and must not be maintained, which is why, in Europe, intellect and rationality can still move among those who are still reasonable, unbiased and righteous, who have not yet allowed themselves to be hopelessly wrapped up in the EU dictatorship, so that the nasty ambiguities of the USA against Russia cannot be enforced, but can be wiped out. That is why all righteous people of Europe must make an effort to defend themselves against the dirty, lying and slanderous machinations and agitations of the United States against Russia in an intentional manner, even over the filthy intrigues and obstructionism of the EU dictatorship, which demonizes Russia as an enemy in a similar pattern to that of the United States. In principle, no sanctions should be imposed against Russia. Existing sanctions must be lifted and understanding and cooperation initiated for the benefit of all peoples of Europe and the whole world and maintained in peace, freedom and justice. And that Russia, in contrast to the USA and the EU dictatorship, does not incite war and hatred against the West, especially not against the USA and the EU dictatorship, but rather holds back against all dirty political attacks, lies and slander. Even a person with a weak intellect and rationality can recognize this, but not the imbeciles and power-obsessed of the EU dictatorship and the US administration as well as its military and secret services, etc. The same applies to the rulers in Kiev in Ukraine, who came to power with the help of fascists in a coup, who show strong anti-democratic tendencies and promote Russian hatred as vehemently as the USA and the EU dictatorship do. Fundamentally, the USA and the EU dictatorship and its individual countries must establish a peaceful policy towards Russia, as well as a foreign policy in general with regard to all the countries of the world, and without any pretenses of annexation with regard to foreign countries. This also includes that all US foreign missions of the US military and US secret services will end immediately, as well as various countries must balance the EU dictatorship, which fly military forces out to foreign countries and let them intervene in their trade. All arms exports to other countries must also be banned and stopped immediately. All nuclear weapons must be destroyed and banned and ostracized from the earth, as well as all drones and other sneaky means of murder by which executions and destruction are carried out. The policy of threats and blackmail, the assassination of all kinds by secret service actions, etc., but also all economic sanctions and procedures contrary to international law, etc., must also be brought to an immediate end. Instead, all world leaders, all military and secret services, etc. must stand up for just peace, for true freedom and justice, just as all state, military and secret service crimes must be punished internationally and all international rights must be defended, enforced and observed, for which the UN must in principle be responsible in its function as a collective security system. Unfortunately, However, the political, military, secret service, and economic powers are caught in the clutches of financial capital, and all of them, along with their power, are enriching themselves financially. This also follows from the fact that there is no withdrawal from the negotiations on the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement TTIP, which really only serves the purpose of strengthening the power bloc of the West, or the USA and the EU dictatorship. And this is in accordance with the fact that it will allow the whole West to continue to rival Russia and China and to reconstitute everything against them. In addition to this, these roaringly power-hungry machinations of the USA and EU dictatorship also serve to prevent the sovereignty and the construction of any democratically emerging self-determination of the peoples, and to make them hopelessly dependent on the USA and the EU dictatorship with allegedly a new free dictates or effective forms of dictatorship. This is also linked to the fact that in Europe all, or at least many EU dictatorship norms are suspended, which allows and enables big business to destroy the economies of other countries and make the countries themselves completely financially dependent on the EU dictatorship and their slave states and vassal states until they go bankrupt and collapse. All this is leading more and more to practically unstoppable malignant antisocial development, and to the fact that in every country of the EU dictatorship, as in the USA, only a few people are becoming rich and owning the largest percentage of the entire nation's wealth. As a result, these few are, and will become much richer in financial assets than the states themselves, which means that the money magnates and asset magnates will rise above the political, governing, military, secret services, etc. as new power elites, and will be able to put them out of power and rule the peoples and states as new elites. Simyase Silver Star Center, Sunday the 18th of February, 2018, 0:58 hours, Billy.
You can do that.
Good. Then I want to ask you now if you can give an answer as to why I had to get to the US government and not the USSR government through EL in the early 1980s to make contact with you through me as an intermediary. Because this matter was never openly explained, which is why I am also always asked why the USSR, or this instead of the USA, was not chosen by you. Of course I know the reason for this, which you have given me, but there is no open explanation for it. Especially also because you have always refrained from any contacts with the USA as a result of their world-dominating behavior, their warmongering, and their constant interference in the affairs of other countries. And it is precisely for this reason that many Earthlings do not understand why you wanted to establish contact with the rulers and the military of the USA through me as a mediator. And likewise, it is not understood why you did not want to contact USA critics directly.
I can understand these questions and explain the following. We did not consider direct contact with state officials, the U.S. intelligence services and U.S. military, for various reasons, which I will explain a little. First and foremost, direct and open contact with those responsible in the United States of America was not possible because, according to our directives, such action or direct contact with Earth or with Earth governments, military and secret services and other organizations is just as forbidden as direct contact with Earth humans. The only exception was when Petra and Anatol were involved in a contact connection, who, according to your instructions, should have assisted you. This connection ended. However, after Ava had brought you to the two of them in Huningen in Alsace, where you were to discuss with them their work, which they were to have taken on, but which unfortunately did not happen, because sometime after your meeting both of them fell victim to an unforeseen fatal car accident, and the planned enterprise was thereby rendered invalid.
Note: Hunningen equals French Huning, Alsatian Hinage High Alemannic, or Heinenschlo Alemannic, is a French municipality with about 7,000 inhabitants. As of March 2018, in the Haute-Rhin department in the Grand Estate region, until 2015 Alsace, and belongs to France, to the Canton Saint-Louis. The neighboring French municipalities of Honingen are Saint-Louis and Village-Neuf. In Honingen, the Canal de Huning branches off from the Rhine, with the Swiss Kleinhuningen, an urban outskirt of Basel, lying to the right of the Rhine. Honingen is directly adjacent to the Swiss city of Basel and the southern Baden city of Weil am Rhein in the Federal Republic of Germany, directly in the border triangle of Germany, Switzerland, France. Together with its directly adjacent neighboring town of Lorach, the whole forms a regional center.
Earth humans other than Petra and Anatole were and are not allowed according to our directives for direct contacts, nor indirect ones. This, however, if we disregard the evolutionary development impulse contacts or impulse information, which we have been radiating extensively to the whole Earth since the 16th century, and which were so directed, towards the development and progress of all very important technical apparatus and devices, and continue to be programmed in this way, that they came directly into the consciousness of earthly inventors, researchers and scientists. As a result, an extremely rapid and far-reaching technical development took place in many diverse electronic data processing areas, which would otherwise have taken a development process of well over 130 years. This, however, could not be justified, because your mission was providently based on the electronic development resulting from the evolutionary development impulses, which had to be geared towards you being able to produce, record, and disseminate your teaching work, and teaching instruction in written form in a good and preserving manner. So the bringing and spreading of the manifold and very wide-ranging teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life required a high electronic technical development, especially related to computer technology, which enabled you to do your wide-ranging works, recordings, explanations, expositions, and the written recording of the manifold teachings. Without the entire technical development of this kind, which could only come about through our efforts to transmit impulses to earthly researchers, inventors, and scientists, it would have been impossible for you to record your teaching work and mission in writing and to disseminate it worldwide in the way that it has come about. And everything had to be like this. For the whole of the teaching had on the one hand finally to be recorded well and correctly and comprehensively in the modern world, and on the other hand to be spread globally, for only in this way was there a possibility that the same unpleasant thing would not happen as in the days of the earlier heralds, who only brought the teaching orally and thus hardly achieved any success. And this led to the fact that their teachings were falsified over decades and centuries in a constantly orally handed down manner and passed on as oral traditions, after which they were later recorded in completely unrealistic and untruthful outgrowths. Distortions, false assertions, and confused interpretations as true teachings of the prophets, etc., by completely untruthful handing down memories by those who knew the scriptures. But this had to be prevented this time, which is why the necessary technical preconditions had to be created so that you could write down yourself everything that was relevant to your missionary work and record the whole thing in writing, which could only happen by enabling the necessary evolutionary impulse transmissions into the consciousness of earthly researchers, inventors, and scientists. These then develop the necessary apparatus and devices which you could use, and by recording the teaching in writing, transmit it yourself unaltered for all time. You were supposed to write 8 books for this purpose, but you exceeded this number by far, and consequently you have written a total of almost 70 instructive books. But to go on to say what arises with regard to direct and indirect contacts and connections between us and Earth humans, the only exception relates to you, for which the reasons known to you are based extensively in your mission and time-honored origin of your spirit form. Although it is possible for us to contact the earthly leaders, military and secret services, etc., indirectly through purely technical means of communication. It is really only as an alternative solution, because we can only consider a communicative technical form due to the blatant difference in vibration between us and the Earth humans, which is why we could not enter into a direct contact solution and also could not do so in the future. This in addition to other things, such as, because it is well known to us since the existence of the United States of America that all those U.S. Americans who were in positions of power in the state leadership, the military and the secret services, etc., have always, without exception, exercised a malicious insidiousness, scheming, deceitfulness, aggressiveness, and belligerence, as well as betrayal, and have always exercised a profound desire for power, as well as a desire for domination, a breach of promise, and a desire to rule over their allies, who are always only expedient for them. And this was already the case at the earliest and most fundamental times. When George Washington, before he advanced to become the first U.S. president, had a white-flagged French negotiating troop treacherously shot dead. And because these facts are not known to today's U.S. people, but also to the majority of the Earth's population, the majority of U.S. supporters from all over the world have always been unthinkingly in favor of the state powers, military and secret services, etc. of the United States of America. However, as in all ancient times, all leaders, military, secret services, and all organizations of the USA today are equally afflicted with world power addiction. Injustice, warmongering, and unconscionability, as it was also at the time when we chose you as mediator between U.S. America and us. And that they are extremely suspicious when it comes to their alleged state security is also known to us. As is also the fact that in truth there is a profound fear of losing control over the entire U.S. population and thus also over the country itself. Especially this fear leads to a self-suggestive martial basic behavior in every single human being of the governing, military and secret services, as well as in the police, security forces and special task forces, etc. of the USA, as is also the case with the members of criminal organizations such as in the USA, among others, the Ku Klux Klan, the U.S. Mafia, that is to say, La Cosa Nostra, the Hells Angels, and the Aryan Brotherhood. And just as these criminal organizations are predisposed, so are the rulers, the military and secret services, as well as all those from all strata of the population who, as fellow travelers, act without hesitation within the same framework and indulge in inhumane and inhuman behavior, while that part of the righteous population who rejects all unjust machinations of the rulers, as well as security forces, etc., has nothing to say. So if we had openly approached the U.S. government, we would inevitably have come into conflict with the U.S. military and intelligence services as well as with various criminal organizations, especially those that are fundamentally xenophobic and racist in their delusions. This, while other similar organizations as well as the government, military and secret services, would have been out to get hold of our technology, which would inevitably have led to degenerate actions with deadly weapons and even to effective warlike degenerations, which would not have led to great hardship and suffering for us, but to much misery for the population of the USA, as well as death, destruction, and unimaginable devastation throughout the country. Also, great hatred would have been unleashed against us by many xenophobic upper elites in the USA, as well as nationwide anarchy would have arisen and epidemics would have broken out, as calculation forecasts have shown. But also many other very hard, difficult, and malignant factors, as these were warningly mentioned in the calculation forecasts in our directives and were to be followed without question, have prevented us from seeking a direct contact for the Earth or Earth humans and from having a teaching effect on them via the USA, in order to bring Earth humans onto a path which should have led globally to peace. Unfortunately, this attempt was already nipped in the bud by the first of our efforts to contact the U.S. government through your mediation and that of ELI, due to impossible, arrogant and megalomaniac demands, as a result of which we refrained from further efforts and will never make another attempt. For Earth and earthly humanity, the opportunity to achieve global peace has been blocked by the pathological self-importance of the U.S. government. The pathological megalomania of those responsible for the rejection of our attempt at contact in the USA clearly proved to us that it will not be possible for us Pleiaren to enter into indirect contact in any other form with those responsible for the state of the USA or with any Earth governments or Earth humans at all.
Note Billy, megalomania is to be understood as a pathological delusion of grandeur, which corresponds to a cognitive distortion through overvaluation of one's own intellect, one's own reason and one's own abilities and competences, but which is also connected with a pathological overestimation of oneself, self-importance, arrogance and with pride as a result of a delusion of self-exaltation, in which the human being believes himself to be great, powerful, master of all things and an important personality, and in this gigantomania delusion displays a maliciously dominating striving as well as bossiness, and putting himself above all human beings, and despising his fellow human beings, whereby these are supposed to be surpassed by the allegedly great and high achievements of the megalomaniac.
This means, however, that through the shameful failure of the USA, with regard to our attempted establishment of contact through you, their old-fashioned, world dominion-addicted and self-important condition will be carried on just as the enmity of many Earth humans and their wars among each other will continue in the old style, and also in the future bitterly evil events and very much disaster will befall the world and Earth humans. And now it is still to be explained why we asked you only to mediate with the United States of America, but not with the USSR. For the reason was solely that at that time, only the USA was big and strong enough to become active on a global scale in accordance with our intended task, while the Soviet Union had largely collapsed and was incapable of fulfilling such a task as we had intended. On the contrary, the USA, in contrast to the USSR, had all the necessary means and all the other necessary possibilities at that time to act according to our instructions and to include the USSR in the whole process in a completely peaceful way. If the megalomania, the imperiousness as well as the self-importance of the state leaders of the USA had not opposed our peaceful, well-considered and selfless attempt with vituperative, nonsensical, and arrogant, as well as senseless and unreasonable demands. And these demands were so marked by self-importance, megalomania, lust for power and domination, that we had to recognize that these unvalues were far too deeply rooted and the whole negative and malignant degenerations to it were so marked that they could not have been changed for the better, the good, and the correct, even by our teachings in useful time.
After the end of the World War in 1945, the bankruptcy of the USSR system quietly and unnoticeably began to take place for the whole world, with which the subterranean dissolution of Soviet nostalgia also began, which then ultimately also actually led to the change and dissolution of the Soviet Union. Although in communist circles the mourning with regard to the communism system has not disappeared to this day. Consequently, even today, communism supporters working in the Kremlin still mourn the lost USSR great power status.
I am aware of that, but now, Edward, I still have a few things to bring up in private, after which I must go my way again.